Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program today, The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance with author Rebecca Clarren. My name is Rachel King. I'm the Executive Director of the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at American Ancestors, and I will be your moderator today. The Jewish Heritage Center is an archive and educational center dedicated to preserving Jewish history, connecting people to their Jewish heritage, and illuminating the American Jewish experience for wide audiences. We are located in Boston at American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, America's founding genealogical organization. We are pleased to host this program today in partnership with American Inspiration, the wonderful author series at American Ancestors, which explores themes of personal identity, families, immigration, and social and cultural history that has shaped this country. As with all of our book events at American Ancestors, we encourage you to support independent booksellers by ordering your own copy of our featured book, The Cost of Free Land, from our partners, Porter Square Books. You can find them at portersquarebooks.com. Before we learn about the book from author Rebecca Clarren, I'd like to make just a couple of housekeeping notes about this webinar. You in the audience will be muted throughout. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to answer as many as we can during the question and answer session, which will follow Rebecca's presentation and my conversation with her. Also, as we are broadcasting from different locations, we hope you'll bear with us if we experience any technological issues. And if there are glitches on your end or ours, we will be sending you a link to the full recording of this session afterwards so you can watch it and share it later. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our featured guest. Award-winning journalist Rebecca Clarren has been writing about the American West for more than 20 years. Her journalism has appeared in such publications as Mother Jones, The Nation, Salon.com, and High Country News, and has won a number of prizes. Her 2018 debut novel, Kickdown, was shortlisted for the Penn Bellwether Prize. And her newest book, The Cost of Free Land, which was just published a month ago, blends impeccably researched history with personal memoir to create a thoughtful, nuanced meditation on American identity and history and legacy. Rebecca Clarren joins us today from Portland, Oregon. So without further ado, welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It is wonderful to be here. This project started with 3 questions. What are the stories we tell in families? What are the stories we don't tell? And why don't we tell the stories that we tell? I grew up being fascinated by the stories that were handed down to me by my family about my Jewish homesteading ancestors on the South Dakota prairie. Stories about them just filled my imagination. There was a story about my Uncle Louis who could stand on the back of a horse. There was a story about my cousin who every morning he would clear a path from his house to the outhouse of rattlesnakes. And he could do this when he was 5 years old. There was a story that is beloved in my family, especially by the women in my family, about my great-great-grandmother, Fega Etka, who every month, including in the winter in South Dakota when it was incredibly cold, she would send her daughters out to the creek behind their house to crack the ice of the creek with like a axe maybe, and then she herself would dunk in the freezing cold water. This was her mikvah, which is a Jewish ritual that religious women do to mark the end of their menstrual cycle. And yet for all of these incredible stories that we had about my family as Jewish homesteaders, there were no stories about my family's Lakota neighbors. The closest Lakota reservation, the Cheyenne River Reservation, was only 13 miles away from my family's land in South Dakota, a place that to this day locals still call Jew flats, but they never talked about their Native American neighbors. I've been a journalist writing about the American West for the majority of my adult life. I've mostly written for national magazines, and when I've written stories about the American West, I have tried to deepen the stories I'm telling with context, nuance, and yet when it came to my own family's history, I maintained a blind spot. It took me a very long time, something I feel almost embarrassed by how long it took me to realize that when it came to the articles that I was reporting about Native America for different places, including The Nation and Indian Country Today and High Country News, I was not an unbiased observer in these stories. That in fact, I was personally involved because, of course, my family had benefited at great cost from the taking of native land. This book, The Cost of Free Land, is what I call an entangled history. It is not meant to be a definitive history of Jewish Americans or Jewish homesteading Americans or Jewish immigrants or a definitive history of Native Americans or of the Lakota Nation. Instead, it's a history of the connective tissue between Jewish immigrants and Lakota, how these histories push and pull on one another. Because I believe at this point that when we tell these histories in silos, you miss the depth of the injustice. You miss the depth of the way that the United States very intentionally picked certain people to benefit from their policies and certain people to not benefit. I think when I started this book, I still thought of history as being something I was walking away from, something that was behind me, something that maybe even lived in a box. And now, and I write this in my book, I've come to think of the relationship between history and the current moment as like thread through a seam. That what has happened in the past, there's a legacy of that impacts us all the time. I started my career at a place called High Country News, which I know many of you are probably on the East Coast and have not heard of, but it's a publication that's been around for almost 50 years writing about the American West. And the late publisher used to say, this is a thinly disguised policy mag. And I think every article I've written since leaving there is trying to show how seemingly boring federal policies, laws that you don't think of very often, how do those actually play out in the lives of individuals and families? And that's why my book actually doesn't start on the South Dakota prairie. It starts in Russia, where my ancestors were living in a shtetl. And if I'll show you in this first photo what their lives were like. They lived in a little shtetl in the Pale of Settlement called Kapulia in what is today Belarus, near the town of Minsk. And this photograph, there's Yiddish, as you can see, written on the top, which says, the translation I've been told is the Hinterish house. And these are my great-grandmother's older siblings. And their lives there were very difficult, just like lives for many Jews in the Pale of Settlement at the time, in the late 1800s, were. My great-great-grandfather, Harry Sinekin, was beaten to within an inch of his life in a pogrom that left him with erratic behavior for the rest of his life. He inhaled that his entire family's home was set on fire, and he always had asthma ever after that. Jews could not own land in the Pale of Settlement. Most Jews could not own land, and my family were among those. Jews couldn't work with certain kinds of metals. So even though my great-great-grandfather was trained as a tinsmith, he couldn't work with gold or silver. And so their options were limited, which is why as more and more Eastern European Jews start to leave Russia and come to America, they come in part because there is such opportunity here. And for my family in particular, they come because some of our first ancestors who come to America learn that, as you can see in the next slide, there is free land on offer in America. They may have found a broadside like this one in a railroad station or in a newspaper advertising very cheap or free land. My family, eventually, by the early 1900s, they moved from Sioux City, Iowa, where they had lived for a little bit, out to the South Dakota prairie with about 30 other Jewish families. And they all come, many of them were relatives or relatives through marriage. And by 1908, they are planting their first crop. And as you can see in the next slide, their lives there were not very glamorous. They're living, this is a claim shack. And the man who is the second to our right, as we're looking, that's my great grandfather. And two men to his right over is my great grandmother's brother. These claim shacks were only about 10 by 12, but they were important because if you were a homesteader, if you got your free 160 acres from the federal government, it was yours to keep if you could prove that you were turning the wild prairie into farmland. So you had to build a structure, and they were usually like these, very simple structures, and you had to cultivate the land. You had to farm it or ranch it. And as you can see in the next slide, my family's first home, if you can see in the background, there is this sod structure. Sod, that was probably their initial home, was a sod house, which is a house made out of dirt. It was really dirty and often just a mess. My family, I don't know how they kept their clothes so white and clean. This photo is amazing to me. The women on the far side of this photo, on the far right, that's my great-great-grandmother, Fega Etka, and her oldest daughter, my Aunt Fanny. And they very quickly learned that it's very hard to plant crops and have successful crops, and they go in for cows, and they're ranchers. Clearly here, these are their dairy cows. This land, though it was very difficult and their life was very hard there, it meant so much to them. My great grandmother always told her daughter, my Aunt Etta, who is still alive, that they called it the good earth. You know, they couldn't own land in Russia. And this meant everything to them. It made them feel more American. It made them feel like they were metabolizing their suspect immigrant status and transcending it. But the land also meant more than something psychological. My research has shown that it actually was very important to them economically. I'm by training an investigative reporter, and I wanted to find a way to take these family stories that had been passed on and put them around some sort of data. So I actually pulled the deed off of every single piece of land that my family owned on the South Dakota prairie. By the 1950s, my family had a almost 6,000 acre ranch. And then I pulled every single mortgage that was taken out by my family members on that land. We don't throw anything away in my family, so I was also sitting on an incredible trove of original documents. I had 30 day diaries that my great grandmother had kept. I had literally thousands of pages of letters, many of them written in Yiddish, that I had translated, that were from my family. I did a lot of research into old newspapers that were reporting on my family's comings and goings. And you begin to see this pattern when you take those original documents and you compare them to the dates on the mortgage payments, is that my family would take out a mortgage and then they would expand their land holdings, or they would take out a mortgage and they might start a new business that wasn't reliant on weather, or they take out a mortgage and they keep their land, but they move to somewhere else. I did a bunch of math. I had someone check my math. And when I adjusted for inflation, the amount that those mortgages came to was $1.1 million. It was a huge amount of money for them. And my family, even though I think it's important to point out, Jewish homesteaders were a very small percentage of all homesteaders, probably something like 0.5% of all homesteaders were Jewish, even though when my family were homesteading, there were about 1,000 Jews homesteading in the Dakotas around that time. But research has shown that as many as 25% of American adults living today descend from homesteaders. There's a lot of us out there. And research out of Brandeis has shown that If you are a descendant of homesteaders and you can afford to own a home or send your children to college without loans, it's probably in part because your family were homesteaders and they benefited, and you have benefited from that handed down wealth. Legal scholars have referred to these kinds of laws that gave land mostly to white people as a huge a form of affirmative action for white people. But the reason the US was, and this land being so valuable, I think I really have thought about, like, what did they know about these important policies that were dictating this, and what did they not know? And what they may or may not have understood is why the United States was so eager to give this land to homesteaders. I'm going to quickly show you this next slide, which is of my family. It's a school shot. You may all have photos like this of your ancestors standing in front of tar paper shacks going to school. But the reason that these people in this photograph were getting, and their parents were getting land, was in part because the railroads at the time were one of the most important corporations of the time. And then, like now, corporations had a lot of power. California becomes a state, and there's a huge raft of natural resources in California, and there's a longing to create a railroad line that will connect California with the East Coast. But what is very clearly evident quickly is that long haul traffic is not going to support the cost of having a railroad. What will support the cost of having a railroad is lots of little short traffic along that rail line. And so that is one of the reasons that the United States decides that we should have homesteads and we should have communities of settlers along those railroad lines. Unfortunately for the United States and for the railroads, when they set out to do this, is the fact that at that time, in the middle of the 19th century, the United States is covered by hundreds of thousands, if not millions and millions, of buffalo, the American bison. And so the United States sets out to eradicate the American bison. This is a photograph from 1892 of you can see it's about 2 stories high. Those are buffalo skulls. There was a famous Army military man who said, kill every single buffalo, every bison dead is an Indian gone. Because what the United States also knew was that in the way of these railroads was land that by federal treaty they had been reserved for Native nations. And so at the same time that they're eradicating the buffalo, exterminating the buffalo go in our country from being in the millions and millions to a couple hundred by the 1890s. The United States is also breaking the promises that it had made with the Plains Native nations. And so in the beginning of my book, as you can see in this next slide, there's this map which we've tried to show the way that the land between 1851 and today, that the way that the Lakota land has been diminished over and over again. In 1851, the United States signs a treaty with the Lakota Nation, reserving all of Western Dakotas for that nation to use. By the time my family is planting their first crop in 1908, the United States has either taken or stolen 98% of the amount of land that was set aside for the Lakota. And they're not just taking the land, they're also, the United States, by official law and policy, is making Lakota religion and culture and traditions illegal. So much of Lakota culture and religion had to do with land. And there's this thinking, if we can divorce the Lakota from their connection to the land, we can take even more of it away. And so that is one of the major reasons that the United States takes Lakota children away from their families and sends them to federal boarding schools, is this idea, if they no longer have a connection to the land and to their family's traditions, then they will no longer care about the land, and it can be used for non-Native people. One of the most surprising things I learned in the course of my research was the fact that the United States treatment of Native people was inspiring to none other than Adolf Hitler. many of the tactics that he would employ to diminish and oppress Jewish people in Europe was inspired by how America had treated Native Americans. There's an entire really wonderful book called Hitler's American Model by James Whitman, who is out of Yale, and he talks about this, the practice of Lebensraum, which was called living space, where Hitler goes into invades Slavic countries so that the Germans and Aryans would have room to move. That comes from the process of the American idea of manifest destiny. Hitler described reservations as the basis for his concentration camps. I grew up obsessed with the Holocaust. I was a kid who thought that I had read everything there was to know about the Holocaust. And yet I never knew that history until a Lakota elder told me that. I'll never forget, we were talking on the phone, and it was the day after Holocaust Remembrance Day. And he said, I was hearing on the radio these people describing being survivors of the Holocaust, and I immediately thought of you and your family. He said, Americans should condemn the Nazis. They should, but they should condemn themselves. We had a Holocaust here for 400 years, and no one ever talks about it. For a long time, I had this question: what did my family know? Did they know what was happening to Native people on the nearby reservations so that they themselves could benefit? And Indigenous judge who has become somewhat of a mentor to me, she said, everyone knew what was happening to Indians. And then in the next breath, she said, but when you're running for your life in terror, which is really what your family was doing when they came to this country, you're not stopping to have a quick restorative justice conversation along the way. She said, it's gonna take several generations of not growing up with that trauma for you to think about this and to do something about it. And she said, that's why it's come to you and to your generation. You were lucky enough to not grow up with that trauma or handed down trauma. And that's why it's appropriate that you now are starting to consider this entangled history. Despite not having grown up with any stories about our Native neighbors, as you'll see in this next slide, I did grow up looking at incredibly mysterious to me photographs of my ancestors posing with men dressed in Native regalia. This is my Uncle Louis standing in the middle of these two men, and I think it's actually in Lake Sylvan, which is in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And as you can see in the next photograph, this on the man in Western dress is my great-grandmother's older brother, Jack Sinekin. And I never knew exactly who this was growing up, but in 2019, when I first started research for this book project, and I was visiting some of the reservations in the Dakotas, tribal historians there told me, that's Joseph Whitebull. And Joseph Whitebull was a really important person of his time. I think this photograph was taken in about 1919. He was the nephew of Sitting Bull, and there's a whole book written just about him called Warpath that was written in the 1930s. And as I started coming and visiting the Dakotas, I ended up meeting Doug Whitebull, who is a beloved former basketball coach and elder and as you can see in the next slide, here's a photograph of him. And he lives on Standing Rock. And the first time I came to his house, he said, I am the oldest living descendant of the man in that photograph with your Uncle Jack. And the book toggles back and forth between the stories of my own family and the stories of the Whitebull family. I'm a journalist, so there's a ton of other history and research and journalism that fills out those family stories. But it's been a real honor to get to know Doug Whitebull and his whole family. And I'm so grateful to them for helping me sort of fill in the white space at the edges of the margins of the stories that I thought I knew about my own family. I think it's important to say that that map shows the diminishment and the dispossession of native land over time. And yet there's never been a time when the United States hasn't actually still been trying to take more native land. That history is somewhat recent. In the next photo, I'd love to show you this photo of Doug. That's Doug when he was a child and his sister Rita. And that's in their family's home that was on the banks of the Missouri River. But in the 1950s, the United States decides to put a series of dams on the Missouri River as a means for flood control. And yet those dams actually flood many communities. And most damage that was done by the flooding caused by those dams was done to native communities. One reservation, 30% of the people living there had to move inland. And Doug and his family had to do that as well. And the land that they end up moving to was never ever as nice as the land where they grew up. There were all sorts of huge cottonwood trees that were flooded and lost in the dams. The best land. So many animals were killed in these floods, so the hunting was changed. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from the book from a time where Doug and I go and visit this land much later. In more recent years, we go back and visit the land where he was growing up. Thank you so much for listening. One day, Doug, myself, and one of Doug's former students, Jeff McLaughlin, drive out to visit what's left of the place where Doug grew up on the edge of the Missouri River. There aren't any roads to get there. Up and down over buttes, we off-road in an old minivan that Jeff calls his Vuck. It's a truck and a van, get it? He asks me with a quick, shy smile. Jeff, like many former students, calls Doug Lake She, Lakota for uncle. As we near the cut bank far above the deep blue water, red chokecherries and wild plum cluster in the folds and creases of the land. When we reach the grassy slope where Doug used to run barefoot with his sisters, I ask him how it feels. Feels great. Feels like home, he says, closing his eyes under the bright sun. Swallows swoop through the sky. The air is filled with birdsong and the buzz of insects and the river and the wind. But for the moment, I'm not noticing any of that. I'm distracted by our effort to touch the past. An old cemetery, fenced off and thick with chokecherry, has survived the flood. While it had been slated for removal, the water never got that high, and the feds, by neglect or delay, left it alone. Deep inside the thicket of wild plants are gravestones of Doug's relatives, and he is determined to visit. Getting there will require this blind old man, who relies on his cane as if it were a third limb, to do the equivalent of bushwhacking. I explained to Doug where to put his foot and how to hold onto my arm and Jeff's arm. I'm embarrassed to share this part, but it's what happened. On the audio file, you can hear my voice asking if this is a good idea, cautioning Doug to be careful. Jeff quietly helps Doug step over the wire fence, gets a camp chair out of the van, and sets it up in the shade in case Doug needs a break. I should have known better. By this point, I knew a lot of Doug's stories, especially his greatest hits, such as the time he, as a teenager, ran a 50-mile race, finishing with bloody feet. I knew about his time at boarding school, where he was repeatedly hit and kicked by his teachers, sometimes with a wooden board across his bottom for the crime of not making his bed correctly. I knew that he'd survived all that and become a straight A student anyway. Not a person given to giving up, Doug slowly but steadily traverses the weedy expanse from the van to the graves deep in the middle of the cemetery. He never slows down, never complains. Standing as close as we can get to the old stones, the words in the marble etched in Lakota, I read the inscription aloud to Doug and he translates. Here was Mary Whitebull, who died May 18th, 1902, at the age of 4. The shade of the chokecherry makes patches across our faces. As Doug takes a moment to contemplate the graves, I'm struck again by the weight of his loss, of what has been taken from him and his family to ensure a specific brand of American progress. There's a debate described in the Talmud, an ancient Jewish text, between two rabbis over what should be done if it's discovered that a house or even a palace was built using a stolen beam as part of its foundation. One rabbi says the entire building must be demolished so that the beam can be returned to its original owners. The other rabbi, the far more pragmatic, says the building can remain standing if the full value of the beam is repaid. Both rabbis make clear that as soon as it is known that the beam was stolen, those living in the house must do something. They must make amends. Our country was built on a stolen beam, Rabbi Sharon Brous of Los Angeles famously said in a 2017 sermon. She goes on to say that to ignore this history and the legacy of this history diminishes the legitimacy and the power of this house, of this nation. The money that has come to the Lakota was arguably never a fair trade for what was taken, rarely a deal negotiated without some degree of coercion. And the losses compound one another. The flooding of Doug's childhood home here on the banks of the Missouri, built on the taking of his father's land and his father's before that. And what of everything else that was stolen? The years Doug spent in fear at boarding school, the state mandated destruction of Lakota language, religion, and culture. What payment can be made to replace such a loss? Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. This is just a remarkable book, and it's so beautifully written. You've done deep, deep research into the history, this history, the homesteading history, and the history of what the country has done to the Lakota and Native Americans in general. You've also done a lot of research into your own family. So I'd love to get to that in a minute, but I did just want to pick up on where you just ended. What payment can be made to replace such a loss, the loss that Doug and so many others experienced? And you also mentioned the Talmud and the teaching from the Talmud. Can you tell us a little bit about your process of working through and grappling with your personal history, with American history, and how you sort of turn to elders in two different traditions to work through that?
Yeah, before this book was even a book, I had been hired by an investigative nonprofit to write a series of stories about Native Americans. And I was very lucky that I got to be sent to write a profile of Judge Abby Abenanti, who is Chief Justice of the Yurok Nation in Northern California. She used to be a state superior Supreme Court judge in California. And she's incredible. And she's really, the way she runs her courtroom with incredible empathy, but also really grounded in the culture and traditions of the Yurok, is becoming a model throughout the country for how to do justice in a very different kind of a way. And she was saying to me, she said to me when I was just still thinking about doing this project, and she said, you know, if you're going to look at these histories, you have to think about how to respond to them. And to do that, you should study your own culture. What did the Jews say about how to respond to a harm, even one you didn't directly commit, but one you've benefited from? And that guidance set me on a journey that I really feel like has changed my life in some ways. I ended up doing a process called Hevruta, which is a very traditional form of Jewish study, studying in pairs. And my rabbi and I, Benjamin Barnett, he's the rabbi here in Portland at my synagogue, we would meet regularly over a number of years studying the Torah and the Talmud, places in those ancient Jewish texts that teach about how to atone and repent and repair. And we also studied contemporary rabbis who are writing sermons based on those teachings. And I don't include every single thing that we studied in the book, but I like to think I picked the ones that were the most helpful to me and the most powerful to me to help me start to think about how to grapple with this history and how to respond to it. And I also did do some, you know, I was very lucky that there were Native elders, Lakota elders who spoke to me and about kind of what resonates for them about how to respond and what would be important for them in terms of a repair. And so that's also in the book.
And can you actually share some of the further resources that you do give at the end of the book for other people who might want to do similar
Yes.
study?
Yes, my favorite, I've been out on the road for the last month, and I love it when people have been coming up to me and saying, I never thought about this history. My family were homesteaders, and until this moment, it never occurred to me to think about where that land came from. And I think no matter who you are, even if you're not a descendant of homesteaders, you are benefiting from the taking and theft and dispossession of native land. Margaret Jacobs wrote an incredible book called After 100 Winters. She's a professor at the University of Nebraska, and she is the head of the Great Plains Center. And she says very directly, if you're living in America today, you're benefiting from the taking of native land. It is the underpinning of our cities, of our highway systems, of our transportation systems. And so because of that, because I do think that this is my own family story, this is my own journey in this book, but if people read it, I think people are reading it and wanting to do their own research, which is such an American thing to do, and I love. I have in the back of the book, there is a section called Resources for Further Research, and it's to help you find yourself in this history, this American history that is all of ours. And I mean, again, these are not definitive resources, but they're the ones that helped me as I was getting started doing this work. So I hope they'll be useful to you.
Thank you. And you do say very powerfully, this is an American story. It belongs to us all. So whether we have that direct family history or not, we have benefited, so many of us. So
yeah, I think there's this one, I just want to say, there's this one story that I love from the Torah, that's this Jewish teaching about, from Deuteronomy, about like what these pre-Israelites are debating. Like, what do you do if you learn that this dead body has been uncovered and there was someone was murdered and you can't figure out who did the murdering? And they decide that the communities that live closest to this murdered person have to measure their distance. And whoever's closest has to not only attend to the body, they have to do a ritual to purify the whole community. And Toba Spitzer, who's a rabbi on the East Coast in Massachusetts, she writes really powerfully a modern day sermon about this teaching. And she says, America's sort of twin original sins were the enslaving of people and the taking of native land. And how do we all measure our distance from that harm? And I love that, because I think about how, my distance is going, as like the descendant of a homesteader, is probably different and closer to that harm than someone who arrived last week or whose family arrived on slave ships. But we all can start to consider our distance in one way or another.
As I mentioned, this is such a deeply researched book, and there are pages and pages of notes and sources at the end. Incredible! It's a whole other book at the end, and fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about so you start with family stories, and you then go into this deeply researched history, and just show this really devastating series of abuses of the Lakota and taking their land. Can you tell us about those two processes of research, both the investigation you did to the Lakota and South Dakota history, but also within your own family?
So I find writing very hard, even though it's my job. But I never ever am tired of the research. I love research, and it's like honestly a way I procrastinate writing is just to do research more and more. So it was such a joy and so fun to do this part. And what I did is sort of, there were so many layers. So in my own family, I interviewed every person who was willing to talk to me of my mom's generation to try and just learn as many handed down stories as I could. And because when you traffic in story, you know, what is fact and what is fiction, but it was a way to start to see how were the stories told. That mikvah story I opened with, everyone had that story and they had it told the exact same way, but other people there were different stories that actually, they shed a lot of light on like the differences, because they were actually very differently told, especially when it came to what really happened on our family's land and how it was sold. Different branches of the family had really different stories about that. I also, as I mentioned, was just incredibly fortunate that there are a lot of lay historians in my family and people who care deeply about family history, including my great grandmother, who she told her daughters, I want you to know where you come from. So she told them the name Kapulia, and she told them, you know, all these stories and facts about how our family got here. And I know that's not always so common in families, and I really benefited from that. There's an incredible resource called the Jewish genealogy. I think it's called Jewish genealogy, and that was an incredible source because you can look up by shtetl all of these resources. I also read a ton of books that had already been written. I mean, I was writing chapters where they were sort of stupidly ambitious and broke my brain to try and write in some cases, because I was writing a chapter about certain 3 major events in history that each of them were deserving and had been written about in their own huge books. So I read a lot. For the Lakota side, I also, it was important to me to not just read Lakota or Native history that was written by non-Native people. So I went to the Dakotas as much as I could, which was tricky during the pandemic. But and at one point, my family, I have 2 young kids, but my whole family, we went on a mashup of family vacation and reporting trip where we drove to the Black Hills so I could do research. And then we drove home one summer. And there's incredible resources, and I would assume this is all over the country. So many small little museums all over the place that would just be sitting on incredible original documents, local histories that you couldn't get anywhere else than just by going. And there's always one archivist. These places are amazing, and they're staffed by volunteers usually, but there's usually at least one person who really knows everything. So I would recommend always calling before you go to make sure you're going to be there on the day where that great researcher is. And I also was really lucky. There's at the University of South Dakota, they have an oral history center, and there were scores and scores and scores of oral histories, interviews taken with Lakota people in the middle of the 20th century. And I used those original interviews to help kind of fill in the stories that were told to me by the Wypels and to understand more directly about people's experience. And I'm really grateful to them. They let me have an hour of their graduate students' times every week. And so I would be like, I'm researching Wounded Knee, and they would dig through the archives to figure out where all the oral histories they have on Wounded Knee, and then and help me know which transcripts to buy and to read up on. So I know I'm leaving so much out here, but that's a bit of what I did. I did also do a lot of original, like looking at old newspapers, even just to understand how old newspapers were reporting then on Native people and on Jews. And you start to get a sense of the racism in the reporting of the early, of the turn of the 20th century. But that was useful too in its own way.
Thank you. I'm curious. So throughout the book, as you mentioned, you're toggling between your family's story and the Wypels story. Doug, who is the descendant whom you worked with and spoke with a lot, the descendant of Joseph Wypel, and your family. You show a lot of you share these family stories. You show a lot of compassion towards your ancestors, your great great grandfather who was really beaten badly in the pogrom and was never right again. But you also show that they were complicit in this history. So I'm curious how do descendants, how do any of us whose ancestors may have participated in really challenging historical events and trends. How do we deal with that guilt? How did you deal with the guilt, and how does the rest of your family now feel about you? There were all these myths that got handed down about the mikvah and the prairie and so on, and the sort of tough, scrappy spirit of your family that so many homesteaders had. But in some ways, you're puncturing some of these family myths. So can you share, how they've reacted to the book, and how the current generation is kind of dealing with this other side of the story?
Well, you just asked two questions and they're both awesome ones. So let me first go back to the question about guilt, which I think is really important because I do think it's somewhat easy to read this history and to feel bad about it. It is upsetting, and yet I have to say I don't feel guilty. I don't. I see a sense of injustice, and I consider the job of an investigative reporter is to see injustice in the world and write about it. And so that's why I wrote this. It was not because I felt guilty. And I'm very informed about the guilt is not very useful. My Indigenous friends have taught me that. I did an event recently with Judge Abby, and she told everyone, she said, guilt is kind of like saying, I'm sorry. And we don't have a word in Yurok for I'm sorry, because you would show traditionally that you were upset and atoning by your actions. And so to me, I think it's important to remember that most of us were not taught Native American history in our schools. I had an excellent education. I really did. And I never learned these details of this history until I worked on this project. And so that was intentional government policy. Even to this day, there's research that shows the vast majority of K-12 public schools are not teaching anything about Native Americans post 1900 to their students. So that's the first step. It was intentional. And I think that doesn't mean we don't now at this moment have responsibility to take our part of our piece of the stolen beam. Now we can, but don't feel guilty about it. The second question you asked is a really important one to me about how did my family respond. And I'm really glad to say that there was no one in my family who ever was at all concerned about me, wanting to write these entangled histories, ever kind of upset about the fact that I would be trying to understand the way we benefited at cost to Native people. But I think it has been hard. It's hard to reconcile these stories we are told about our ancestors, which most of the ones I had followed, I think, what's a classic script. They're very plucky, they're very tough, they're very religious, they care about their family, they always look so good in every single photo, and they're flattering clothing. And to see these people as more real and more human, and to see their flaws, it's hard. And I've had some really tender and hard conversations with cousins of mine and relatives about how it's heavy to see that. And I write about this in the book, how my Aunt Etta asked me directly, like, don't write about some family secrets that I end up writing about anyway. There's plenty of family secrets I don't write about. And I'd love to tell you all about them, but I won't today. But I did pick the ones that to keep writing about because of that thing I said at the very beginning. I really wanted to show how government action and policy ripples in the lives of real people. And so it's the family stories that I tell that are shameful to some people in my family. I told because it helps tell a bigger story. And I get into the details of that on the page in the book. But I am happy to report that even those relatives who were really like worried about me telling certain family secrets, they've been able to hold two things at once. I've been getting like I've had incredible conversations where they're saying to me, "This is hard. This is hard to read this, and I'm so proud of you, and I love you." And my aunt Etta wrote me a beautiful email right before Yom Kippur this year, and she said, "Thank you for helping me be more of a realist at the age of 90," which makes me just feel hopeful for the rest of us. So,
Aunt Etta is one of the many wonderful characters in your book.
yes.
Let's turn to some of the questions from our audience. There's some really wonderful ones. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So there are some questions about sort of reparative or healing actions that you could or might take, and you do address this in the book. Could you speak briefly to that, how you yourself through study
Mm.
and contemplation, your own process have come to that?
Sure. I don't like to center myself here usually, but I guess since you're asking, yeah, I end up well, I should start by saying, we're in a vacuum of federal leadership on this issue. The United States, unlike other countries in the world who have a history of dispossessing indigenous people of their lands and have started to step toward apologies and grappling and reparations, even, we're not doing that in America. But that doesn't mean there are lots and lots of individuals and churches and communities that are stepping towards how to do local reparative efforts. There's a really wonderful podcast and website called Reconciliation Rising. I note this in my book, that are tracking these kinds of repair efforts. You may have heard of land taxes that different cities throughout the country are doing, where they're often called gifts, where you acknowledge as an individual or as an institution that you live on land that was unfairly taken from a specific native nation, and you give a gift toward that nation every year. I, after a lot of thinking and a lot of conversations with Doug Whitebull and other Lakota elders, and with my own rabbi, and reading these Jewish texts, I have come up with a reparation. Do you think I should talk specifically about it, Rachel?
Um, well, I do want to get to some other questions. You have come up with a reparation, and maybe
Yeah.
we'll let people know
Okay.
they can
They
read
should read the
about it
book.
in
Yeah.
the book.
Okay. Like it.
And it is obviously, as you explain, it's personal.
Yeah.
And we might come to this in different ways.
Yeah.
But as with everything else in the book, that your process of getting there is incredibly thoughtful. So there are several questions about, is the land still in the family? And, sort of a related question on, are there still descendants of Jewish homesteaders? I don't know if you can speak to that, but you mentioned Jew Flats, which is this area, abutting the reservation.
Yes.
Do you know if there's still descendants, if
I'm
not from your
so
family line?
glad for this question. So I should have explained. Jew Flats is a little bit to the northeast of Wall Drug. If any of you have ever stopped for water at Wall Drug, about 25 miles to the northeast of there. My family sold our last bit of Jew Flats in 1970, and when we sold the land, we sold it to my great uncle Louis's best friend. So another white descendant of homesteaders. But that family still owns all of Jew Flats, all of our family ranch, and they still ranch it. I just recently was interviewed by a Dakota newspaper, and I learned something that I didn't know, which is that there are the least number of Jews per capita of any place in America in the Dakotas. There are not a lot of Jews left there, even though there were quite a few at the very beginning of the 1900s. And my ancestors, I've learned the Black Hills were really settled dramatically by a lot of Jewish people. So I hope someone goes out and does some research or helps me learn the research of why there aren't as many Jews, why there are so few Jews now there. But there is a great homesteading history in the Dakotas of Jews and others, actually.
I think so many of us know the history of Jewish Americans largely in the cities in the United States. It's less well known, the many Jews who moved west, and there are some fascinating communities that were built across the country. Here's a question which, definitely the current moment lends itself to. Can the perspective on American history that you portrayed also be applied to the history of Israel and Palestine? And there is a connection around land and sort of historic ties to the land.
It's a really good question. I think I know so many of us are feeling really upset and scared and angry about what's happening in the Middle East, and I think it's really natural to want to look to my book and this entangled history and see connections. I will say that I am not an expert in the Middle East, and so I don't want to get out over my skis, as some people in the West like to say, but I will also share that there are certainly Native writers. Nick Estes wrote a really wonderful history called Our History is the Future. That's a history of Lakota resistance. And he right there on the page makes connection of feeling a lot of resonance with Palestinians. So there are people who have made that connection. And I have been hearing from a lot of readers that they're reading my book and they are finding it helpful in considering the Middle East, but I don't want to say that it's the same because it is different. But I'm really just, I think it makes me feel glad if people are finding some comfort in this book in this moment. I'm grateful for that.
Let's ask one last question, which is, what has been happening with, and you do address this in the book, what has been happening with the land and with efforts to return it to the Lakota?
Well, there are efforts undergoing. For the Lakota, the Black Hills which are in South Dakota in the majority, is their spiritual home. It is the center of their universe. And the United States Supreme Court itself ruled in 1980 that the United States stole that land from the Lakota Nation, stole the Black Hills. And as you may know, the United States offered to pay the Lakota for that land, and the Lakota would not take the money because they said, you don't take money for your mother. This land is like our mother, and we just want the land back. And so there are efforts that are underway that Native nations and others are working who are non-Native. My family is helping with this effort a little bit, are helping buy private land as it comes up for sale and holding it in trust for the Lakota Nation to use for ceremony and to use however they want. And those conversations at different times in history have been larger. Obama said he would get the Black Hills back for the Lakota people. That never, of course, happened. At the moment, there's really no politicians that I know of who are taking a lead on this in a major way at the federal level, but it is happening in bits and pieces over time, and it's happening. There's a really wonderful organization called the Indian Land Tenure Foundation that has been working for a long time. It's Native led, and it's been working to help Native nations expand their land and get back land that they've lost over time. So if you're interested in contributing to an effort that's ongoing, I would direct you to that organization. And again, I reference them in my book as well.
Thank you. And there are also some efforts to rebuild the culture.
Oh yes, so sorry.
And
Yes,
which is so important.
Oh yeah.
As you noted, the culture and the land are so intricately tied. one another. So, well, Rebecca Clarren, I want to thank the audience for asking such thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of them, but you can find Rebecca on her website, Rebecca-Clarren.com. I believe that's it. Is that right, Rebecca?
That's right. Yeah.
This is just a remarkable book, and we hope that you will that we wish you the best of luck on your book tour, and that I know there'll be some readers from this audience who will eagerly buy the book. So thank you so much for your time this evening, and for your insights, and for the gift of this story.
Thanks for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
Terrific. Well, I do want to remind everyone that if you would like to buy your own copy, we hope that you will purchase it from our partners at Border Square Books, bordersquarebooks.com. And I'd also, before we leave, I'd like to let you know about some upcoming programs with both the Jewish Heritage Center and American Inspiration. This month, the Jewish Heritage Center hosts a program on November 30th, a webinar about our new online exhibit, Jewish Neighborhood Voices, featuring interviews with individuals who grew up in Jewish immigrant neighborhoods, in urban neighborhoods, in the first half of the 20th century. And in time for the Hanukkah and Christmas season, we present the Chelsea Carroll incident of 1949 in December, on December 11th. You can learn more about our events, past and upcoming, at jewishheritagecenter.org/events. And American Inspiration has 2 events coming up this month, including a co-sponsored program tomorrow night featuring Margaret Atwood and her new collection of short stories, Old Babes in the Woods. And on November 20th, Sarah Lohman speaks about endangered eating. And you can learn about these and many other American Inspiration programs at americanancestors.org/inspire. So I want to thank all of you in our audience again for joining us. As you leave this program, you will be asked to take a very brief survey. We hope you'll take just a minute to fill it out, as your feedback is very valuable to helping us develop further programming. We will also be sending you a follow-up email with a link to this recorded presentation. I invite you to learn more about the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center on our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. And I also want to mention that this free program has been made possible by contributions to the Jewish Heritage Center and to American Ancestors from people across the country and around the world. We ask you to please consider making a donation of your own to support our educational and archival work. Thank you so much. We hope you'll join us again for all these wonderful upcoming programs. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Rebecca Clarren, and goodbye for now.